Welcome to Episode 1 of Rise of a Nation, The Journey of Independence and Expansion. This episode is on the United States of America.
Welcome to our deep dive into American history. We're going to be taking a look at how each state joined the Union, along with some of the major wars, key presidents, and the evolution of civil rights. It's going to be a really fascinating journey, kind of like weaving a tapestry.
I like that analogy, starting with just 13 colonies and ending up with a nation that spans an entire continent. It's pretty remarkable.
It really is. And we're not just going to focus on dates and names. We're going to dive into the context, the conflicts, the compromises that really made America what it is today. So let's start at the very beginning with the American Revolution. It really laid the foundation for everything that followed.
It's true. The American Revolution, which lasted from 1765 to 1783, wasn't just something that happened overnight. It was years of tension that finally reached a boiling point. You see, Great Britain was trying to get a handle on war debts, so they tried to exert more control over the colonies. Specifically, they really started pushing taxation, and that's when things got interesting.
It's pretty amazing how a simple tax dispute could escalate into a full-blown revolution. What were some of those key events that really fanned the flames?
Well, the Stamp Act of 1775 and the Townshend Acts were really big triggers. These were like direct attempts to raise money from the colonies. And the colonists, they were having none of it. They felt like they were being taxed without any say in the British Parliament. Basically, they felt like their rights as Englishmen were being totally trampled on.
They didn't just sit back and complain, though. They took action. Pamphlets were a huge deal back then, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely. Pamphlets were like the social media of their time, seriously. Take, for example, John Dickinson's Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. His writings were super influential. They argued against those British policies and got a lot of people on board with the resistance. This period also gave rise to amazing speakers like Pappy Henry. His speeches, especially the Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death one, really fired people up.
So basically, from heated debates in pamphlets to all-out protests, things were escalating quickly. And then there was the Boston Massacre in 1770. That's when British soldiers actually fired on unarmed colonists. That had to be a turning point.
Totally. There's still debate about the specifics of the Boston Massacre, but there's no doubt that it fueled the anti-British sentiment. It pushed the colonists to form the Continental Congresses. These assemblies brought colonial leaders together so they could figure out how to respond to all this chaos.
So were the Continental Congresses kind of like the first brainstorming sessions for a brand new nation?
That's a great way to put it. In 1774, the first Congress tried to smooth things over with King George III. They hoped for some kind of reconciliation. But by 1775, after the battles of Lexington and Concord, the Second Congress realized they needed to get serious. They established the Continental Army and put George Washington in charge. That was a huge step. It basically marked the start of the armed conflict.
And George Washington, just a planter from Virginia, ended up leading a ragtag army against the biggest superpower of the time. Those first battles couldn't have been easy wins, right?
Definitely not. They were up against the British Empire after all. But their surprise victory at the Battle of Bunker Hill in 1775, even though they suffered a lot of losses, showed everyone how determined they were. It also proved how good of a leader Benedict Arnold was, at least back then. Who would have thought he'd become infamous for treason later on?
It's amazing how regular people became these fearless revolutionaries willing to risk everything for independence. And then, on July 4th, 1776, they made it official. They declared independence with the signing of the Declaration of Independence.
The Declaration was way more than just a Dear John letter to King George III. It was a bold statement about liberty, equality, and governing themselves. And we can't forget about the help they got from other countries. The Declaration convinced France to join their side, and they provided much-needed military and financial support.
It really makes you think about how a war fought right here had global consequences. The American Revolution wasn't just about independence. It was about creating a new nation based on some really radical ideas. And it's pretty amazing how those ideas inspired revolutions and democratic movements all over the world. But winning independence was only the first step. Now, they had to figure out how to govern themselves, which led to the creation of the Constitution, right?
Exactly. The Constitution, adopted in 1787, was brilliant. It established a system of government with three branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. This whole separation of powers thing, it was pretty groundbreaking back then, aimed at preventing tyranny,
Okay, so break it down for me. We've got the legislative branch, which is Congress, made up of the Senate and the House of Representatives.
Yeah.
They're the ones who make the laws, right?
That's right. And then you've got the executive branch, which is headed by the president and vice president. They're the ones who actually carry out those laws. And finally, we have the judicial branch with the Supreme Court at the top. Their job is to interpret the laws and make sure they don't clash with the Constitution.
It's a pretty ingenious system that's kept American democracy going for centuries. And to keep things in check, there's this whole concept of checks and balances. Each branch can actually limit the power of the others. Speaking of checks and balances, let's talk about how the president is elected. A lot of people find the Electoral College confusing.
It is a little tricky. The Electoral College isn't a straight-up popular vote. Each state gets a certain number of electors based on its representation in Congress, the number of senators plus the number of representatives. There are 538 electors total, and to become president, a candidate needs to snag at least 270 electoral votes.
It's a system that reflects all the compromises and concerns those founding fathers had. They were trying to balance things out between the big states and the small states. And here's a fun fact for you. Washington, D.C., even though it's not a state, gets 3 electoral votes thanks to the 23rd Amendment. Okay, let's jump into those first 13 states that signed off on the Constitution and made the United States official.
It all started with Delaware, the first state. They were the first to ratify the Constitution back on December 7th, 1787. They might be small, but they played a big role in getting this whole thing off the ground. And as we go through each state, I think it's important to talk about how civil rights evolved too.
Totally agree. We need to see how the nation dealt with equality from the very beginning. So in 1790, just a little bit after the Constitution was ratified, Congress passed the Naturalization Act. And get this, it said only free white persons could be citizens. That left out a huge chunk of the population. That early restriction set the stage for centuries of fighting for equal rights.
It really shows that those ideals of liberty and equality didn't actually apply to everyone back then. Next up is Pennsylvania, known for its Quaker history and being a center of business and industry. They ratified the Constitution just 5 days after Delaware on December 12, 1787. William Penn, the guy who founded the colony, wanted a place where people of different religions and backgrounds could thrive. It definitely attracted a lot of diverse settlers.
And then there's New Jersey, the Garden State, known for its agriculture and strategic location. It joined the Union on December 18, 1787. It's cool to see how those early states, even though they were small, played huge roles in the Revolutionary War. They hosted major battles and contributed a lot to the fight for independence.
For sure. And we can't forget Georgia, the last of the original 13 colonies to get on board with the Constitution on January 2, 1788. Georgia was founded by Jings Oglethorpe as a safe haven for people who were in debt, but their history is complicated, particularly in how they treated Native Americans and enslaved Africans.
Next, we have Connecticut. They became a state on January 9, 1788. They were pretty ahead of their time with their fundamental orders from 1639. It's considered one of the very first written constitutions in the Western world. Shows you how committed they were to democracy from the get-go.
Right. And then there's Massachusetts, where the American Revolution started, a place known for its intellectual and cultural scene. They ratified the Constitution on February 6, 1788. Think about it. From the Boston Tea Party to those legendary battles of Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts played a big role in winning independence, and later on they'd become a hotbed for the abolitionist movement leading up to the Civil War.
And don't forget Maryland, known for its Catholic roots. They joined the Union on April 28, 1788. Lord Baltimore founded Maryland as a refuge for Catholics. Their early history was marked by religious tensions, but they also developed a pretty strong sense of tolerance and pluralism.
Right after Maryland comes South Carolina, a state with a really complex past tied to slavery and the whole plantation economy. They became a state on May 23, 1788. We can't forget that South Carolina would be the first state to secede from the Union in 1860, which was a major catalyst for the Civil War.
Then we have New Hampshire, known for its rugged landscape and independent spirit. They became part of the U.S. on June 21, 1788. New Hampshire's early contributions to American literature and philosophy, with writers like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, were super influential.
Oh, yeah. Next in line is Virginia, the mother of presidents. It's impossible to separate their history from both the amazing things and the really tragic things that have happened in America. They became a state on June 25, 1788. They gave us founding fathers like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison, but they also experienced brutal Civil War battles. Virginia has always been right at the heart of shaping our nation's destiny.
Right after Virginia is New York, a global city and a symbol of American diversity. They joined the Union on July 26, 1788. From its beginnings as a Dutch trading post to becoming a financial and cultural hub, New York has always been a place where people from all over the world come to chase their dreams.
Absolutely. And then we have North Carolina with its gorgeous beaches, amazing music, and a complicated history when it comes to race relations. They became a state on November 21st, 1789. From the Outer Banks to the Blue Ridge Mountains, North Carolina is full of contrasts. They've made a lot of progress, but still face challenges in achieving true equality.
Last but not least, there's Rhode Island, famous for its independent spirit and maritime traditions. They were actually the very last of the original 13 colonies to say yes to the Constitution, finally ratifying it on May 29, 1790. It's interesting that Rhode Island, which was really hesitant to give up its autonomy under the Articles of Confederation, waited so long. Shows how much they valued self-governance.
What's really amazing is how all 13 of these colonies, each with its own distinct history and identity, managed to come together and create the foundation for the United States. They set up a whole new system of government and laid the groundwork for a country that would one day stretch across a continent.
It's like putting together a giant puzzle, where each state is a crucial piece that completes the bigger picture. But the story doesn't stop there. We're about to move beyond those original colonies and head west into the territories that would eventually become states themselves.
This westward expansion was driven by this thirst for land, resources, and opportunity. It would totally shape the character of our nation and bring all sorts of new challenges, especially when it came to slavery and whether it would be allowed to spread into these new territories.
And this is where those themes you mentioned, the wars, the key presidents, and the constant fight for civil rights, they all start to play out on a national stage. This is a period where those ideals of liberty and equality were constantly being tested and redefined.
You got it. So buckle up, because we're heading west, and this is just the beginning of the story. As we go further west, it's important to remember that westward expansion wasn't just about grabbing more land. It was about spreading those American ideals, for better or worse. And this is when we see a whole bunch of new states joining the mix, each one adding its own unique flavor to the American melting pot.
It's like the nation was a giant canvas. And each new state added its own brushstroke to this evolving masterpiece. So which state kicks off this whole westward expansion thing?
That would be Vermont. They became the 14th state on March 4, 1791. Now, here's the interesting thing about Vermont. They actually started out as a completely independent republic. They governed themselves for 14 years before finally deciding to join the U.S.
Wow, talk about making an entrance. What made them change their minds after all that time?
Well, a few things. The economy was a factor, and they were also worried about potential threats from British Canada being so close by. Joining the Union gave them protection and stability. And then just a year later, on June 1st, 1792, Kentucky became the 15th state. Kentucky was actually part of Virginia originally, but as people moved westward and political power shifted, it made sense for them to become their own state.
It makes you wonder what those early political debates were like.
Yeah.
As these new states were being formed. Okay, so next in line is Tennessee. They became the 16th state on June 1st, 1796. Tennessee played a significant role in the Civil War, a conflict that would soon put the whole nation to the test.
Tennessee becoming a state really highlights that tension between slave states and free states. It was a delicate balance that became harder and harder to maintain as the nation expanded westward. And speaking of tensions, let's talk about the War of 1812. It might not be as famous as the American Revolution, but it was a defining moment for American identity and foreign policy.
So this was basically round two with Great Britain, right? What were the big issues that led to this war?
It was complicated. A bunch of things were going on. Britain had imposed trade restrictions. They were forcing American sailors to serve in their navy. And they were supporting Native American tribes who were resisting American expansion. It lasted from 1812 to 1815 and had huge consequences for America. It really solidified our independence, fostered the sense of national unity, and changed the relationship between the United States, Great Britain, and Native American tribes forever.
And it's amazing to see how the nation kept expanding even with all this conflict going on. Ohio, known for its industry and its role in presidential elections, became the 17th state on March 1st, 1803. Right in the middle of all this international drama.
Ohio becoming a state just shows how population and power continued to move westward. And, another big power shift happened around that time, too, the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. That was a bold move by President Thomas Jefferson. It literally doubled the size of the United States, opening up tons of new land for people to explore and settle.
Can you imagine the excitement? The possibilities must have seemed endless. It's like having a whole new continent to discover. And speaking of new discoveries, Louisiana, with its unique blend of French, Spanish, and African influences, became the 18th state on April 30, 1812.
Louisiana's statehood is a great example of how different cultures and traditions were starting to have a bigger impact on the United States. And then there's Indiana, the crossroads of America. They became the 19th state on December 11, 1816. Indiana's agricultural heartland and its location as a major transportation hub were huge factors in the nation's economic development.
Absolutely. And we can't forget Mississippi. They became the 20th state on December 10, 1817. Mississippi's history is closely tied to the legacy of slavery and the fight for civil rights. It's a constant reminder of that long and ongoing struggle for equality and justice.
Mississippi's entry into the Union really underscores the complicated and often tragic history of westward expansion, especially its impact on Native American tribes who were forced off their ancestral lands. And speaking of displacement, Illinois, the land of Lincoln, became the 21st state on December 3, 1818.
Illinois is a great example of a state that went from being a frontier outpost to becoming a major player in both economics and politics. And then we have Alabama. They joined the Union as the 22nd state on December 14, 1819. Alabama's history is all about balancing those traditions of the Old South with the ongoing fight for racial equality. Those two forces continue to shape its identity today.
Alabama becoming a state brings us back to the issue of slavery. It was a constant source of tension and conflict in the young nation. And speaking of conflict, let's talk about Maine. They became the 23rd state on March 15, 1820.
Now, Maine's entry was part of the Missouri Compromise, wasn't it? That was a pretty important political agreement that aimed to keep things even between slave states and free states.
Exactly. The Missouri Compromise allowed Maine to enter as a free state, while Missouri came in as a slave state. It was an attempt to stop slavery from tearing the nation apart. But let's be real, it was only a temporary fix. Those tensions over slavery were still simmering beneath the surface, just waiting to erupt. And speaking of Missouri, they officially joined as the 24th state on August 10, 1821. But their entry sparked some pretty heated debates about whether slavery should be allowed to spread into new territories. It just goes to show that the issue of slavery was always lurking in the background of American politics.
It's fascinating to see how each of these early states, each with its own unique story, contributed to the growing tapestry of American identity. Some were all about progress and change, while others were holding on tight to tradition and resisting any kind of reform.
Yeah, you're right. And as we move further into the 19th century, those tensions are just going to keep escalating, eventually leading to the nation's biggest challenge, the Civil War. But before we get into that really tumultuous period, let's talk about a state that took a pretty unusual path to joining the Union, Texas.
Yes. Texas, the Lone Star State. They definitely have a story unlike any other. In 1836, they fought a fierce battle for independence from Mexico and declared themselves a republic. They were their own country for almost 10 years before deciding to join the United States.
Yeah, it's like they had a test run at being a nation before finally deciding to join the party. So what made them decide to join the U.S. in 1845?
Good question.
Several things influenced their decision. Their economy was a factor. They were worried about security. And let's be honest, there's a certain appeal to being part of a bigger, more powerful nation. But Texas becoming the 28th state on December 29th, 1845, had some major consequences. It basically led directly to the Mexican-American War.
Yes, the Mexican-American War. Another turning point in American history. It lasted from 1846 to 1848 and started with a disagreement over the Texas border. But it quickly turned into a much bigger conflict about territorial expansion and national ambition.
Absolutely. The Mexican-American War resulted in the U.S. gaining a ton of new territory. But it also made those divisions over slavery even worse because now everyone was fighting over whether these new territories would allow slavery or not. It was a major issue in the national debate.
Right. And during this crazy time, Florida, the Sunshine State, known for its beaches and diverse ecosystem, joined the Union as the 27th state on March 3, 1845. Florida becoming a state shows how important the South was becoming in American politics and economics.
And right after the Mexican-American War, Iowa, the Hawkeye State, became the 29th state on December 28, 1846. Iowa's entry into the Union reminds us that the nation kept expanding westward despite all the controversy over slavery and the cost of war.
It's like each new state added another layer of complexity to American identity. And next we have Wisconsin becoming the 30th state on May 29, 1848. Wisconsin's story is all about its German immigrant heritage, its role in the labor movement, and its dedication to protecting the environment.
Wisconsin's statehood reflects the growing diversity of the American population and how much immigrant cultures were shaping the development of the nation. And speaking of diversity, we can't leave out California. They became the 31st state on September 9, 1850.
California, the Golden State. known for Hollywood, its tech industry, and its incredible natural beauty. California was a huge addition to the Union. It really tipped the scales in favor of the free states.
Yeah, California becoming a state was a turning point in the whole slavery debate.
Yeah.
It put even more pressure on the nation to finally deal with this issue that had been dividing everyone for decades.
It's like California showed up and forced everyone to face reality.
Yeah.
And now we're getting close to the Civil War, at a time when tensions were running incredibly high and the future was uncertain.
Yeah, the nation was teetering on the edge, deeply divided over what to do about slavery. Adding new states only made things worse. It felt like a powder keg just waiting to explode.
So let's talk about Minnesota and Oregon. They both joined right before the Civil War broke out. What were their stories like? And how did their entry reflect this growing national divide?
Well, Minnesota, known for its amazing farmland, became the 32nd state on May 11th, 1858. It was in a strategic location perfect for westward expansion. It helped fuel the nation's agricultural growth and strengthened its presence in the northern territories.
And then there's Oregon with all its natural resources.
Yeah,
It became the 33rd state on February 14, 1859. But their path to statehood was full of arguments about land rights and Native American territories. That seems to be a recurring theme throughout American expansion.
It does. And, both Minnesota and Oregon's entries into the Union were kind of overshadowed by this looming crisis of slavery. The nation was on edge, completely split over what should happen to this institution. And every time a new state was added, it just made those tensions worse. It was a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, it really felt like every new state was just adding fuel to the fire. And then in 1861, it finally happened. The nation erupted into the Civil War.
It was a brutal time. The Civil War lasted from 1861 to 1865, and it was mainly fought over slavery and states' rights. 11 southern states decided to leave the Union, and they formed the Confederate States of America with Jefferson Davis as their president. It was a truly tragic time, Americans fighting against each other. It divided the nation and left scars that took a long time to heal.
It's hard to believe that a nation founded on the ideas of liberty and equality could be torn apart by such deep divisions and injustice. It's a dark chapter in American history that we can't ignore. So what were some of the key moments that shaped this conflict?
Well, there were many, but one of the most important was when President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. This declaration freed all the enslaved people in those Confederate states. It was a huge blow against slavery, and it changed the whole moral landscape of the war.
The Emancipation Proclamation was a major step forward, but the fight for full citizenship and equal rights for African Americans would continue for generations. It's a reminder that ending slavery didn't automatically end discrimination.
You're right. The fight for racial equality would continue throughout the 20th century, and even now with the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s being a pivotal chapter in that struggle. And while the nation was still dealing with the aftermath of the Civil War, a new state emerged, West Virginia.
West Virginia's story is unique because it was formed from 50 counties that broke away from Virginia during the war. They decided to stay loyal to the Union and became the 35th state on June 20th, 1863, right in the middle of the conflict.
West Virginia's statehood really shows just how complicated things were during the Civil War. Loyalties were divided, and people were really questioning what it even meant to be an American.
And once the war ended, the country entered a period called Reconstruction. It was a time for rebuilding and trying to heal those wounds, but it was also full of challenges and setbacks.
Reconstruction was when those crucial amendments to the Constitution were passed. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments abolished slavery, granted citizenship to everyone born or naturalized in the U.S., and said you can't deny someone the right to vote based on their race or their past. Those were huge steps towards equality, but putting those amendments into practice, especially in the South, met with a lot of resistance.
It goes to show that progress isn't always a smooth path, and that fighting for civil rights is a constant battle. But even amidst all these challenges, the nation kept pushing westward. Nevada, known for its casinos and deserts, joined the Union as the 36th state on October 31st, 1864. Right in the middle of the Civil War.
Nevada's entry into the mix just shows how powerful that pull of the West was. It represented opportunity even in the face of a national crisis. And after the Civil War, Nebraska, with its vast prairies and its agriculture, became the 37th state on March 1st, 1867.
Nebraska is really connected to the Homestead Act of 1862. That act encouraged people to settle in the West by offering free land if they were willing to farm it. It had a big impact on settlers and Native American tribes alike.
The Homestead Act did open up tons of land for settlement, which led to a big agricultural boom, but it also meant Native American tribes were pushed off their land and their traditional way of life was disrupted. It's a complicated legacy for sure. It shows both the good and the bad sides of westward expansion.
Let's jump ahead to Colorado. They became the 38th state on August 1st, 1876. Kind of a centennial birthday gift to the nation.
Colorado, with its Rocky Mountains and its incredible beauty, represents a shift from the industrial age to something more modern. It embodies a growing appreciation for nature and this desire for adventure and being outdoors.
And then in 1889, we see a bunch of new states all joining the Union in the same year. North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and Washington.
Those states are known for their wide open spaces and their unique cultures. They represent the end of that frontier era and the completion of the contiguous United States. It's a symbolic moment, the closing of a chapter in westward expansion.
And we can't forget Idaho and Wyoming. They joined the club in 1890, each adding their own unique contributions to the mix.
Idaho with its mountains and wilderness, and Wyoming with Yellowstone National Park and its role in the fight for women's suffrage. Each played their part in shaping American culture and identity.
Then in 1896, Utah, with its stunning red rock formations and its Mormon history, became the 45th state. Utah's story is all about religious freedom and the challenges that come with blending different belief systems into American society.
And to round out the 19th century, we have Oklahoma joining as the 46th state on November 16, 1907. Oklahoma's history is unfortunately marked by the forced relocation of Native American tribes, a reminder of the darker side of westward expansion and the consequences that followed.
As we move into the 20th century, we see America facing new challenges and opportunities. New Mexico, with its diverse landscapes and its rich Hispanic culture, became the 47th state on January 6, 1912. It's a sign of how much Hispanic culture was influencing the United States.
And just a month later, on February 14, 1912, Arizona, home of the Grand Canyon, joined the Union as the 48th state. With Arizona's entry, the contiguous United States from the Atlantic to the Pacific was finally complete.
It's incredible how, in a little over a century, the nation transformed from those 13 colonies on the Atlantic coast into this continental powerhouse with 48 states. And the story didn't end there. In 1959, 2 more states joined the party, Alaska and Hawaii, completing the 50 states we know today.
That's right. Alaska, with its vast wilderness and its importance during the Cold War, became the 49th state on January 3, 1959. And Hawaii, with its tropical beauty and Polynesian culture, became the 50th state on August 21, 1959. Their addition marked a whole new chapter in American history, expanding the nation's influence across the Pacific and highlighting its role as a global power.
It's been an incredible journey, tracing how each state joined the Union. From those first 13 colonies to westward expansion and beyond, we've seen wars, social movements, political shifts, and the constant evolution of what it means to be American.
As we look back at this incredible journey, it's clear that America's story is still being written. Each state, with its own unique history and character, continues to add to the ever-changing tapestry of American culture and society.
What will the next chapter bring? What new challenges and opportunities will shape the nation in the 21st century? Those are great questions to think about as you continue exploring the rich and complex history of the United States. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thank you for watching Episode 1 of Rise of a Nation, The Journey of Independence and Expansion. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe for more. Write in the comments what country's independence and expansion you would like me to cover next.